Welcome to Empowered Communication. I am Meredith Holley, a workplace conflict mediator, communication coach, and attorney. This podcast is intended for informational and entertainment purposes only. It is not intended to substitute for legal advice or for therapy. Laws are different in every state in the United States, especially when it comes to employment law, and in every country, they're also different. If you have concerns about your workplace experience, we encourage you to seek counseling, seek therapy, seek any modality that might help you, and to get legal advice from an attorney in your area. So excited to introduce you all today to James Anderson. He is one of my brilliant, amazing, wonderful past clients. And he has so graciously agreed to talk about his story. We always sort of follow the rules when talking about our stories on this, that we usually just don't bring up people's names. We don't talk about employer names because we don't want to give free advertising to people who kind of aren't doing this stuff right. We want to talk a lot about people who are doing it right, like James, and highlight him. And just really, I just think there are so many people out in the world who really are making impacts on their workplace. And for those people, it seems like nothing is changing. It seems like everything's staying the same. It seems like almost sometimes impossible to make the kind of change that we know the world really needs. And then I think you can take more of a bird's eye view and just see it from a little bit more distance and say, okay, like there was change that happened here. And while I was in it, it maybe didn't seem like it, but it really did. And so James is sort of on the other side in some ways of a really difficult work experience. And so I think in some ways it's easier now to look back and say, okay, there was change that was made. And then in other ways, like, oh, that was really just hard. And there was a lot of resistance there. So James, will you tell us a little bit about yourself and your cultural background and upbringing?
Absolutely. I'm James Anderson. I'm the only one of my brothers that has a completely American name because I was named after my white dad. He was in the military, U.S. Army. When he met my mother, he was stationed in Japan around near Hiroshima. And so I'm half Japanese, was born in Japan, moved around to a few Army bases. But for the most part, I grew up in the Springfield school systems. I was going to school here in Springfield since first grade.
In Springfield, Oregon.
Yeah, Springfield, Oregon. Yeah. So my history is from this community. It wasn't until, so I was raised by my white grandparents. I attended a predominantly white school system. It was almost completely white going through public school. It wasn't until I was an adult that I started seeking out the Asian community and people of color and started volunteering and immersing myself in people that looked different like myself from the white community.
So what made you do that? I know we've talked a little bit in the past about you kind of, after you left high school, you had some pretty blue collar jobs, kind of, is that right? And it had sounded like it didn't necessarily register with you so much that, I don't know, even like that discrimination and harassment was real, or tell us a little bit about how you were at that point.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a household, like I said, I was raised by my grandparents on my white side, and they were from the South. As much as I loved them, they had some deeply ingrained problematic beliefs about race. And this is just how I was raised. So growing up, you internalize it. I did. I'll just speak for myself. And the other minority students that I attended, there was just a few of us. We became indoctrinated when you're exposed to it all the time. And when you're experiencing that from your day to day and you're exposed to it from like a formative age, you just become to accept it as being the normal. Growing up in the 80s and 90s, there was overt racism, but there's also a level of discrimination that most people aren't aware of. Being exposed to that every day, the microaggressions, the passive aggressiveness, I've come to just expect it as being the norm.
And I think some people absorb that as like, oh, there's just something personally wrong with me. Like I know a lot of women say, oh, well, it's not that women are bad at math. I'm just bad at math. I've just been told that I'm bad at math, or I'm not athletic, or whatever the stereotype is about women. It's just about me. And then for other people, they kind of absorb it and even engage in it. And they're like, this is just how people treat each other. Was there a space that you landed with that? How did that happen for you?
Yeah. I just came, growing up, and almost all of my friends were white. It was really weird. You would think that I would have flocked to other ethnic minorities, but in a way, just being exposed to that, in a lot of ways, we kind of recoiled from each other because we didn't want to stand out. We didn't want that label. We didn't, to be ethnic minorities. And I saw it then and didn't recognize it. And I see it all the time now, but you even see people that are ethnic minorities that say and believe racist things.
Right.
I hear that from friends and acquaintances, coworkers in the past that were Black or Latino that would say, oh, no, that's not racism. That's just the way they are.
Because it's safer to absorb into it, right, than to stand out.
We're pressured to accept it. We stand out already. We get labels like, we're disagreeable, or we're, conflict oriented, or we're, overly sensitive. If we point out, hey, excuse me, but that's racist.
Right.
The stereotypes that's racism. And the white coworkers, family members, community members, church members, they're really fond of reminding you more often than not that, you better not point this out,
You're the problem if you point it. Label the behavior. You're the one.
Social pressure in place,
right?
That I've come to recognize as systemic racism.
So tell us a little bit about what changed for you. How did things change? How did you start to notice, wait, this isn't normal or how I want to live?
Gradual. I can't think of necessarily one specific aha moment, but when I started volunteering and surrounding myself with other Asian community, I started with involvement with Eugene Taiko, the Japanese American Association, the Asian Council. I started surrounding myself with other Asian people, and we would talk, and they would have stories that confirmed my discomfort and things that stood out for me. I started going into my adult years and started expanding my social group. I started meeting LGBTQ people. And during the 80s, growing up in Springfield, everybody was homophobic in varying degrees. It was just, again, we were just taught that was acceptable. But then I started meeting people, that were in that demographic. And I started to learn about who they were and their experiences. And it was gradual. It was a gradual process. But I just started to learn, hey, you know what? There's a lot of stuff that I've been taught, from my formative years as being normal, values that are completely wrong, that are irresponsible, they're hurtful.
Right. It's so interesting how those changes can happen. And some of us have this push to create a kinder, more compassionate, more connected world. And that there is some kind of innate drive of correcting injustice in some way, like seeing something as injustice and even just knowing what that feels like in our bodies. Because I was raised really similarly. I was raised in a sexist, homophobic, religious. And then as I started making friends who were gay, I was like, wait, I love this person. They're not doing anything. There's nothing about them that's not perfect. Like, this person is amazing. Why would I be afraid of this wonderful person because they love somebody? And then once you look at it and you're like, oh, I just don't need to be afraid about that anymore. You can release it and it's so much better. That's really interesting. But I love what you said about engaging in community. I think that's one of the reasons that I want to do these conversations, is because I think that there are communities out there that support people who want to make positive change. And when we're on our own, it feels so isolating and so hard. So in your situation, you were working in like an operations maintenance kind of job in a city. And you started just over the course of many years.
Yeah, I worked there for 10 years total.
Yeah, in like really persistent sort of racist behavior, but also a lot of pressure not to talk about it. Can you tell us a little bit about?
Yeah. So first of all, even before I was hired out there, the operations director and some of the key employees were exposed by the local media, by the newspaper and a couple of other pieces of media, for exchanging very racist and disgusting emails. I grew up in this town, so I mean, I have, a long history here. So this, the good and the bad, where I perceive my home to be. I thought, okay, this is an opportunity to start. The bad part got exposed, and I was really excited to be a part of this new, social change. So I ended up getting hired at this operations division, and over the years, I started getting involved with diversity. They had a diversity committee I got involved with. When I first started, it was like really kind of weird. It was like my thoughts, my expressions, just who I was, was really, there was like a lot of peer pressure, I would say, to not ask questions, not to be different. And there was a lot of pressure. But as things turned out, the people who were involved and exposed in this article for being racist and exchanging these racist, sexist, they actually, most of them have been promoted to positions where they had more responsibility and influence and make more money. And that's how the systemic racism in this organization actually protected and rewarded the people.
Which I think is a important point and an interesting point. I think that we, a lot of times, there's a lot of cultural pushback about cancel culture, and there's a lot of cultural pushback to not expose people, to say, oh, you're going to destroy this person's career if you talk about what they've done. Not that their behavior will destroy their career, but that you talking about their behavior will destroy their career. And in my experience of doing, now I think it's been hundreds of these, like helping hundreds of people with this kind of thing and doing employment cases also, I do not see that very commonly. It is tough to destroy someone's career by talking about their behavior. Most often something comes out like that, and then there is an incremental change that happens. And mostly the incremental change is people getting a little bit in their minds that maybe it's okay for me to talk about my experience because somebody else did. And it's a small change. It's not a big destroy career change. It's a small moment of maybe one more person will talk about their experience because someone else did. But you went into this job kind of thinking, oh, well, now it's going to be fixed because it's been exposed, right? And that just sort of wasn't the case. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Can you give us some examples of the kinds of experiences you ran into? I know there's one experience that always stands out to me of people, someone saying that you were the problem. Like a lot of times people just sort of said you were the problem. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that?
If you are what I perceive to be a personality who is a truth seer or a truth speaker, you're the first person to become the public enemy in that group. You become an outcast. And I experienced that a lot. The group that I worked for, and I had a lot of friends, I would say that I got along with and really cared about and respected the vast majority of my coworkers there. On some level, I was able to find commonality. But as a whole, as a collective, most of them were very close-minded. They were very, and I blame the management for this, and from the management in operations all the way up to the HR, city managers, even the city council and the mayor, I thought was part of this equation of dysfunction and deceit and manipulation and coercion. They had tools, they had tactics that they used to keep people quiet from being problem people, even if they had a right for speaking their truths. And it leaked into the work culture. They were so toxic and backstabbing. There was a lot of bullying, just a lot of insulting behind people's backs. But that was absolutely all, I believe, built on a foundation of discrimination, multiple forms of discrimination.
And one of the things that one of your bosses would do, I think you said, was like come into like the locker room kind of area and be like, oh, let's go for a drive, right? Is that...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so this was the director. He was I perceived him to be a serial liar. He was very manipulative, very deceitful, used coercion tactics or kind of like built-in forms of bribery. In some cases, he would offer people special jobs if they would do certain things. And they would isolate me. They would isolate me from my coworkers, just kind of passive aggressively kind of spread rumors or just indirectly let coworkers know that, that certain things that I said and did wasn't welcome. But he would also take me and other employees for these rides where they would talk in a way that there wouldn't be any other witnesses. He could completely deny. Plausible deniability was a common tool that he used to keep people quiet. He would come into the locker room when I was either changing into my work clothes. And it was psychological. He knew what he was doing. He was predatory minded in that way, where he knew not only was he the director and I was a new employee, and he would hold that over employees' head, that power differential. But he would stand there when I was half dressed and have conversations, and he would make it known that my career was in his hands and that I wouldn't have a job for very long if I continued to make waves, which included me asking questions about why is this being allowed? At times I would be using the urinal, and that put me in a position of being kind of exposed and vulnerable. And he was a very tall man. He would come up to the urinal next to me when there was no other witnesses in the locker room and say these really kind of cryptic but clear phrases. It was very predatory.
And the idea was if you kept asking questions about employee rights or unfair treatment, that you were not welcome in the workplace. And then when you were talking about people being rewarded, I think I do talk about a lot about rewards in the workplace, but that's always, you always want to use rewards in a positive way if somebody's doing their job well, and even to help people do their job well, to encourage them to show up. But these rewards were used in a way where if you engaged in the culture of silence, then you were promoted. If you reported that he was a good director, then you were promoted. But if you questioned any of the management, then you were not welcome. Is that kind of getting it right?
Yeah, rewards are a great motivation, I think, if they're issued on an equal and fair level to everybody. The difference to me, I mean, everybody has like an influence. You can influence people or you can manipulate and coerce them. But one is like really open and positive and affirming. And then one is like has some built-in threats and uses fear to motivate people.
I remember there was one other supervisor, and this is the one that stands out to me, but tell me, I'm not remembering the exact scenario, but he had said to you something about you being the reason that his culture was being, you were a threat to white culture somehow. What was that situation?
I strive to find commonality with people, and that's something that growing up with my white grandparents from the South had in common. I grew up on some acreage. We were kind of redneck in certain ways. We were traditional, lived out of city limits. We had chickens. We got up in the night if our dogs started barking, and we would shoot raccoons or possums if they were breaking into our chickens. And that's a culture that I had in common with the person you're talking about. He comes from a very rural area, but at the same time, he had some very serious discrimination built in, not just racism, but he was very sexist, very homophobic. And we had a conversation one time where he did tell me that with my diversity work and my effort to try and increase the diverse hires, because they were only hiring white people only and almost all men when I started there. He told me, he explained to me that the work that I did with diversity and increasing and women represented to him an end to his culture. And he was talking about, white men from rural backgrounds.
Right. He was talking about white supremacy and patriarchy, right? Yeah.
People don't like to use those words, but that's exactly what it is.
Yeah, because it's true. And so people like to make it sound nice, but that's what it means.
Yeah.
So you were there for quite some time while this is all going on, pretty consistent, like this type of behavior, weekly, monthly. Like you had a lot of people that you got along with there, like a lot of great work that you did.
I still have friends that I keep in contact from there.
Absolutely. And yet in the background, there's kind of this overarching theme of don't try to make too much change. Like let things be, and don't you be the problem. And then you started applying for promotions and not receiving them, which clearly linked to the idea that you bringing in diversity, you talking about employee rights was a problem. How did you, as you sort of started realizing that you were going to need to enforce your rights in a legal way, how did you feel in the workplace? What was that like for you?
I felt betrayed. It was a major form of disillusionment because I'm a personality that I always assume the best in people. I always just assume that people are naturally sincere and honest. And sometimes it takes me a long time, especially when I'm invested in a person. You work with people for years and you begin to care about them, even when they have very hurtful beliefs that you don't approve of. It's hard for me to work with people and not develop some form of connection. You come to care about people and you make excuses for their behavior.
Right.
And you minimize it. And I did that. And it took a long time for me to actually realize that this was deliberate and that it went all the way to the top of the hierarchy. It wasn't just in operations. It was the whole. It was HR. It was the city managers. I believe the city attorney did certain things to keep things either contained or suppressed. The mayor, in my opinion, is the big, if not cause of it, he's an enabler. And enough of the city council. It's just the whole culture, even the state level. I provided you with evidence, paperwork that showed that even the system that is meant to fix the problem and address it are part of the problem.
And so you're talking about, so in Oregon, and this is true in most states in the United States, when you bring a legal employment claim, one of the first steps is to go through an agency process. Federally in the United States, that's called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. But in most states, or in many states, there's also a state level one that co-files with the EEOC. And ours is called the Bureau of Labor and Industries. And the Bureau of Labor and Industries has gone through cycles of different leadership, which it should. And most agencies should go through cycles of leadership and have new leadership. But it has struggled. It's an agency that is kind of an interesting setup because basically you file and you get assigned an investigator if they accept your complaint at all. The investigators are, for the most part, not lawyers and don't and have some training within, we call it BOLI, but Bureau of Labor and Industries. They have some training, but the training is pretty specific often to their investigative role, and it's not legal training. So many lawyers find their results somewhat like we don't necessarily rely on them. But the other thing that was happening when you filed was they had hit a point where they were pretty backlogged, and I think they're getting a little less backlogged now is my impression, but a lot of the investigators typically would have 200 or 300 cases that they would be dealing with at the time. And so and if you think about someone who's like not trained as a lawyer, they're just dealing with these investigations in the way that they've been trained to do, and they have like 200, 300 cases. Like it's a pretty set up to fail. It's not set up. But at some point, some folks did some research and this may be different now. It's changed over the years, but the statistic that we typically had seen was that it was something like 92 to 97% of complaints within this agency went against employees. Pretty similar, in my view, to the legal system. What would happen is you have this government set up that says, hey, if you have a workplace problem, come to us, solve it. And you go to them and you pretty much hear nothing. Like you hear anything, you get reassigned to other investigators. They don't intervene. They might have a phone call with you and ask you some sort of aggressive questions about why you might be lying. And then they come out with a determination that says we couldn't substantiate any discrimination, which unfortunately tends to validate discriminatory behavior rather than correcting it.
Yeah.
It tends to make a person like you who's trying to access the system, and you can correct me if I'm getting this wrong in your case, but like in my experience, it tends to make you feel pretty gaslit that you've been asked to come forward with this, and now you're sort of being questioned and suspected, and maybe you're even being believed. Sometimes you're not believed, but even if you're being believed, sort of your experience is being minimized instead of validated.
Absolutely. So in my case, I would find out in the stats that you gave right around in the 90% that kind of dropped the ball with employees. I also talked before you took my case, I talked to another employment attorney that confirmed kind of that ballpark figure that from my experience, the intake officer, the investigators that I worked with, I sensed that they were very idealistic and had good intentions. And the majority of them were trying to do the best they could with the workload that they had. I know of two other city employees at the time that I came across that had also filed complaints against the city in two different departments than mine for discrimination and or retaliation. One of them was in the city police department, and one of them was, I'm not going to say because it's a smaller department, so I'm going to keep them anonymous.
It's another department, yeah.
Yeah, so this was around within a year, right around the time that I filed mine. It took a year before they even filed the complaint. And then it got dragged out. It was like 2 years total. And then they just sent me a letter saying, we didn't come to a conclusion. Sorry, you're on your own, basically. I don't know if you wanted to get into this part, but the leader at that time was an elected position.
It has been the whole time. Yeah, it always is an elected position.
Yeah. I found out that she was actually a resident just outside of the city that I lived and worked for and was running for Congress. So something like that, a scandal coming up wouldn't have been conducive. I filed a request for public information after my case was closed. And here it is. That was like a year and a half, almost 2 years ago. And still I haven't gotten anything.
And you're not the only one. I mean, that pretty much,
Yes.
there's
Willamette Weekly covered a series of articles where this person is under investigation, federal investigation right now because of disappeared documents on her personal electronics. And and I still haven't gotten mine yet. So
within that, it also is a systemic thing. There's one person who works in their public records office in that agency, and she's like a very nice person, but like think about every investigator having a couple hundred cases. Like there are hundreds of people trying to go to her to get records. It's just not a system that's set up for success. And I think it's unfortunate because, like you said, there are a lot of people within it. There's a new labor commissioner now who I think is great and really cares about employees. There's tons of people in there who really care about employees. And then you have this major institution that is just very bureaucratic, very untrained investigators. Like there's a lot of systemic issues that do impact a lot of people. But to me, I think what you went through with that is really typical of a lot of people who want to make change in the workplace. And I think for me, my takeaway is that I sort of thought going into the law, okay, like the law is a system that helps people who are hurt. And my takeaway now is that that's not necessarily the case, but it's still worth people who have been harmed in the workplace figuring out solutions that do heal that harm and that do make the change that they want. I think one of the traps of the legal system is that it takes so long that we keep going to it and say, okay, now it'll work. This time it'll work. Okay, if I try this one more thing in the legal system, that's really going to be the thing that will make the change. Instead of, I think what is the healthier and more productive thing to do, like to try it and say, okay, is this going to work? And then pretty quickly, if it doesn't work, move on to another option and really have that list of 100 possibilities of things that might effectively make the change instead of continuing to invest time and energy into a system that at the end of the day may get an employee some money, but may not, and really all we're allowed to ask for in the legal system is money. So I think it's like not always what people sometimes absolutely is what people are looking for and they should look for it. And they've had huge financial hits and absolutely it's the right thing to do. But if it doesn't work, I think one of the tough lessons that you had is, do you spend that 2 years waiting for it to work? Like, do you continue to go after it if it's not going to follow through for you?
Yeah, the system for me, and we talked about this a lot, with your coaching, it was a form of purgatory.
Yeah.
It was just kind of this no man's land, where no person's land, where you're just kind of in a suspended state, and you're ruminating because you're stuck, you're helpless about making change. And I don't think in a lot of ways that's an accident. The city that I worked for had so many tactics to keep employees quiet and suppressed, deceive them into thinking, okay, investigation was one example, or we're doing an internal investigation. We're going to look into this. Just be quiet and be a model employee. Just take the tactics, the system that we subscribe for you. This is going to be in your best interest too. Just do what we have laid out for you. Go through this maze and eventually, we'll reward you by coming out with the truth. Well, this maze has no exit. It's just a maze of bureaucratic red tape, city policy, employment law, union laws.
And confusion, honestly. Yes. And I think that, to me, I agree with you that I think it's not unintentional. Like I always say, the United States was founded and the government was founded to protect white men's property. And it just does such a good job at that. And all the institutions are unconsciously built around a framework of protecting white men's property. And so it's hard to deconstruct a structure that is so solidly built for one purpose. And I think in most big public entities, what you're experiencing, I think I totally agree with what you're saying, that it does go up and down the whole hierarchy. I think for the most part, for most people, it is unconscious. I think most people aren't how can I go support white supremacy today? But I think in our unconscious minds, we're so programmed to say, oh, that's a threat. That's not normal. Oh, that's a threat. Oh, James is making waves. That's not normal. Let's just calm everyone down. Let's not make waves. And that language of be normal, don't make waves is really what is the conscious part of it. And then unconsciously, what we're doing is really promoting those discriminatory systems.
Yeah, that was my experience.
Yeah.
In fact, the place that I worked for, this government entity, the mayor, the city council at this point, all executives, almost all the managers are completely white.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And Springfield has, Springfield, Eugene area, it has a certain amount of diversity built in, so the people are there, just not being included.
Right. Because unconsciously we've been trained that white is normal when there's nothing to say that, like the vast global majority of people are Black and Asian. It's like vastly more global majority than white people. So we went through your process together and you ended up deciding to separate with the city and resolve your claims that way, which I think for you, but tell me if I'm wrong about this, it seemed like for you felt like a good choice. Like it felt like the right resolution at the time for you. What kind of led you to ultimately decide that separation was like a good way to resolve things?
Well, I had already, by standing up for myself and calling out the deceit and the lies and the discrimination, I had already put myself under the crosshairs for a long time from management. And there were other members of the diversity committee that they created that was supposed to be part of the solution that either resigned or were terminated in some cases. I had a friend from India that was put on a performance improvement plan, a PIP, which is basically, my understanding is, most of the time it's just a way to document, the narrative of the employer before they get rid of an employee. And they basically did away with this diversity committee by not supporting them. So it was just a matter of time, I think. If I would have just said, hey, let's let bygones be bygones, I'll go back to work and we'll just pretend like everything's resolved. But no, the operations director, like I said, he was actually exposed already a decade before by the media for being racist. And the city manager, the HR director was complicit, with coaching them on how to use, the system to retaliate with these fabricated disciplinary investigations. And it was the same thing that the police department made the news for multiple times, these fake disciplinary investigations to keep their employees quiet. And it was the same thing. It would have just been more of the same. The HR director would have helped them fabricate more stuff. The system, HR and the city managers kept telling me, just work with us. Let us resolve this. We're looking into this. They just kept me quiet for all this time. Employees didn't even know what I'd been going through. Some of them understood because they saw their own examples, but a lot of them didn't want to see it. It didn't benefit them because they were white, almost all of them. And so they would start their narration. Oh, there goes James again, talking about, equality and equity and his diversity committee stuff. And they didn't even know what all that I'd gone through and documented. So going back wasn't an issue. It would have been just coming back to like this really abusive, toxic background. And it would have just been the same thing that had been going on over this 10 years.
I think that's such an interesting point, because for me, when I was in my situation, I was like, okay, this is my career job. Like, I've talked about my sexual harassment experience on the podcast before, but I was like, this is the only place that I can do this work in this area. Like, this is a career. Am I willing to give up my career because these people are not good at handling a discrimination issue? I think your situation was interesting because you had a lot of time and energy invested in this workplace. You had put a lot of effort. You had done a lot to create positive change there already. And then at some point, I think we have to say, how can I move? Where can I move? And where people want that kind of energy, where that energy is welcome, where like all the drive that I have to make this positive change is something that people want to see and embrace, versus something that is so resisted and punished, even though you know how important it is to you. And honestly, like for you and a lot of other people who have been marginalized in the workplace, it's not a optional thing. It's not like you're making these decisions because it's a hobby for you. It's because it is your identity and you're going to experience the harassment and discrimination no matter what. So making positive change is the right option. I mean, it is the only option sometimes for people. But I think like for you, like something that I saw in you that I really admire is that you have this drive to make things transparent, and transparency is so important to you and truth is so important to you. And in this structural setup, that was so designed to repress transparency, create narratives. Like that was such a mismatch for who you are as a person too, that how much more energy did you want to, like, I think at some point you got to a place of like, how much more energy did you want to sacrifice to this place that completely doesn't appreciate all what an amazing talent and skill that is.
Thank you. Yeah, that is a part of my value system is transparency and fairness and equality for everybody, even people you disagree with. And that's kind of, and I'm in that kind of spot right now to where now I've got to try and see if I can find an organization that I can work for. I'm in that transitionary period right now where I'm looking for an organization that wants a change, that wants that transparency instead of just saying that. And that was one of the things that I had such a huge problem with where I worked was just all the propaganda, and every place, every person has their own perspective and narration. But just how much resources, money, time, effort went into constructing a false narrative to the community. It's like after a while, it's just like, even though I loved the majority of my coworkers, there comes a point where I had to question, okay, this is who I am. I could change who I am, and in some ways I'm always open to improvement and developing myself. But there are some things that I learned to be, a certain way because of my experiences. I don't want to compromise. Yeah, I don't want to compromise my values. So that's what I'm looking for now is I'm trying to find a place that really wants people that are truth seers, that are truth speakers, that are earnestly. And a lot of my time with the diversity committee where I was working before didn't even pay me for my time. They talked a big talk about how they were supporting the diversity committee and this was the solution. But most of my hours were voluntary because they didn't want to stand up to the operations. So it was a lie. That was like a passive, lies of omission are still lies when you're deliberately withholding information that the community wants to know. So yeah, that's kind of, I'm in the process of repackaging myself. Yeah. Hoping to offer some place in the community that actually wants to use.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're still in a transitional space, which, a lot of people who I'm interviewing are in all of these different spaces with, like you're a little more recent than some of the people, other people that I'm interviewing. And I think that there's just a spectrum of how we embrace who we are and embrace that side of us that is not going to back down when somebody is lying. I think for me in my situation, one of the biggest transitions that I had to make for myself was being willing to be fired because I was going to care for myself first. And I wasn't going to sacrifice my integrity just to be accepted in the group. And that's a hard thing to do. It's a hard decision to make, to being willing to be kicked out of the group because you're not going to sacrifice your integrity. But I think it is a valuable skill. And like just the willingness to do something hard like that, the willingness to rise to a challenge, I think is a tough place to be in. But before we started recording, you said that you feel like a weight has been lifted off you because you're not engaging with that anymore. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. And that's something else I wanted to bring up just to encourage, other people in the community that are going through this. Because I think all of us have felt marginalized or outcast in one way or another, or bullied or separated, segregated. But I would want, any of your viewers, any of your future clients, anybody in the community that's going through this, whether it's through their work or, any other aspect of life, there are times to where you have to kind of go into dark, scary areas in the world and stand in who you are, your values, what you know to be right, even when, and we're social creatures. Most of us don't like conflict. If we do, we're reacting defensively or because we feel like we're cornered. That's how I am. I don't like to hurt feelings, but there are times to where you have to stand firm in who you are and you have to prioritize what you're feeling. And my heart goes out to people that are going through this with their work, whether they're being treated differently because of their religion or because of their ethnicity or their gender, or maybe they're on that LGBTQ continuum and they don't quite fit in. And even non-protected ways, some people that come from poverty. I remember I had friends in school that had like just worn out clothes, old clothes, they were dirty. We're treated differently. It's to be completely honest, it is going to be disruptive. It's going to be painful and scary. You're going to be subjected to all sorts of peer pressure, probably coercion from, your superiors, or if we're talking about like a church setting or some kind of nonprofit you belong to, you're going to get feedback from other people in positions of authority that are going to be discouraging you from saying your piece. But if you really believe in it, I would encourage you. And of course, you got to pick your battles. You can't go through life always sticking your neck out because it wears you down. It's psychologically abusive and toxic emotionally. If you're going through this, I would just say, having gone through this dark period. And I went through, as you know, Meredith, I went through deep depression. My social anxiety came out, my anxiety in general. I was really questioning myself. I was really doubting what I experienced. It's the ultimate, use the term gaslighting. It's an ultimate form of gaslighting. And like I said earlier, in a lot of cases, it's not accidental. I would encourage people that are going through this, reach out to the people that you can trust, that do understand. There are people out there that are trying to be part of the solution. There are people out there that will affirm, what you're going through.
Right.
There are people that are tired of all of the racism, the systemic, even unintentional racism. I don't think I ever would have been able to let this go if I just would have kept with it. But I am so glad that I finally did something. I had to figure it out as I went along. I didn't have the solutions, but I reached out. Meredith, you were one of them that supported me. Other members of the diversity committee, like I said, a lot of them resigned or were fired. And then certain coworkers from operations that I had that I confided in that knew what was going on, that were also truth seers, truth speakers. They stood by me and supported me.
Yeah. I think the more we talk about what we're experiencing, the more we find people who get it and who have similar experiences. I think that is just one of the crucial, foundational, valuable things that we can do is even when people are discouraging us from talking about our experiences, finding safe people to talk to about our experiences, I think is key. I also think that, sometimes people in your situation think, I'm going to tell the truth, and then everyone's going to know the truth and everyone will see it. And unfortunately, that's just not how things happen in my experience. But I do still think telling the truth makes that incremental change that has a long-term impact, even if we don't see it in the moment. And we rarely see it in the moment. It's rarely an explosive, big change. Every once in a while it is. But even then, there's backlash that's not satisfying, even with a big change. And a lot of times, it's just that 1 degree difference. But when you turn a ship 1 degree, it ends up in a very different place. And I think it does make long-term impact. It just is hard to carry that burden when you're inside of it.
It's hard to see the forest for the trees when you're actually under the pressure at that time.
Yeah.
But I agree, that's how changes always come. It's never come from just people just being collaborative and just going along with the flow. And it become small increments at a time through people who are unfortunately willing to take risk and address the status quo.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your service to the community and for sharing your story. It's so valuable, and I always love chatting with you. And
Same here.
Thanks again. I appreciate it.